London, 1812, where the ton gathered beneath chandeliers to witness scandal disguised as dance, and where the Prince of Elberdon was expected by birth, by duty, and by every matchmaking mama within a 50-mile radius to wed a duchess, or at the very least a viscount's daughter. What no one expected, dearest listeners, was for His Highness to fall headlong and hopelessly in love with a village maid who had never once curtsied to a titled man in her life. But let us not trip headfirst into the climax. All proper tales begin with a carriage, a ball, and a dreadful misunderstanding. His Serene Highness Prince Valentin of Elberdon arrived in England under the diplomatic guise of strengthening ties between his small but glittering principality and the crown. He brought with him a valet who complained of English dust, a trunk of embroidered waistcoats, and a reputation for being as charming as he was imperious. The ton, naturally, received him as they would a comet or a royal christening by gossiping about him relentlessly while pretending to be entirely indifferent. "Is it true," whispered Lady Belling, not 2 dances into the Marchioness of Eastmere's spring ball, "that he refused to shake Lord Tilling's hand because the man's cravat was improperly tied?" "It was limp," replied Lady Farncombe with the gravity of a sermon. Such a sign of moral decay in a gentleman. Meanwhile, the subject of their scrutiny stood near the orchestra with a glass of champagne and a gaze that might have been carved from marble. Prince Valentin was tall, dark-eyed, and so impeccably tailored that one might suspect his coat had been sewn directly onto his frame. He bowed when he must, danced when duty demanded, and smiled only when it served a purpose. And yet, for all his regal hauteur, it was not in the candlelit ballrooms of Mayfair that our story truly began. No, it began beneath the dripping hedgerows of Sussex, where a certain lady girl, if we are to be technical about it, was stomping through the mud with a basket of wild thyme and absolutely no idea that her life was about to become the stuff of whispered legends. Daphne Sparrow, daughter of the village apothecary, had freckles like spilled cinnamon, a mind full of poetry, and a tongue that had got her into more trouble than any proper maiden should admit. She read Latin by moonlight, quoted Virgil while milking goats, and had once corrected the vicar on the proper use of a subjunctive. In short, she was wholly unsuited to the attentions of a prince. And yet, it was a week after the Eastmere ball that fate, that most meddlesome of matchmakers, intervened. Prince Valentin, bored of London's endless parade of débutantes and duels of etiquette, had ventured to the countryside in pursuit of authentic English character. This author cannot say what he expected to find Herrick's bucolic charm, a cow named Lady Mabel, but he did not expect to be nearly trampled by a cart, driven at suspicious speed by a girl in a threadbare bonnet, quoting Horace. "You might have killed me," he barked, brushing dirt from his sleeve, though the cart had missed him entirely. "You were in the road," Daphne replied, not the least abashed. "And if you don't know how to leap aside like a sensible man, that's hardly my fault." He blinked. "Do you know who I am?" "No," she said cheerfully. "But you're very clean for someone in a hedge." This, dear reader, was the moment. Not the dance, nor the duel, nor the stolen kiss that would come later. This was the moment Prince Valentin, heir to a throne, felt something shift. It was not love heaven forfend. The man was too proud for that. But it was the beginning of something inconvenient and thrilling. "I am Prince Valentin of Elberdon," he said. She squinted. "Is that near Derby?" He actually laughed, the sound sharp and surprised. "No, it is on the continent." "Well, you're a long way from it." And with that, she tipped her bonnet, clicked her tongue, and drove off, leaving the prince staring after her as though he'd seen a ghost, quote Cicero. By the next morning, the entire village of Aylescombe buzzed with the news that a foreign prince had nearly been flattened by Daphne Sparrow's herb wagon. Mrs. Pritchard, the baker's wife, claimed she'd seen them exchange heated words. Mr. Bellamy, who had not been within shouting distance, declared he'd heard the prince call her enchanting. He had not. And old Miss Greaves simply sighed and said, well, he wouldn't be the first man to lose his wits over a Sparrow girl. As for Prince Valentin, he found himself returning to the village under the pretext of purchasing lavender. One cannot help but marvel, dear readers, at the number of diplomatic errands that require lavender. Daphne, for her part, was unimpressed. You cannot possibly need more sachets, she said on his third visit. Do your boots eat them? I am. Fond of the scent. he replied, though he was beginning to loathe the very color purple. She tilted her head. You've never bought anything but lavender. Surely your kingdom has other needs. He looked at her then, really looked, and found her eyes were not merely hazel but flecked with gold, like sunlit leaves. It has many needs, he said slowly. But at the moment, I find myself interested in English customs, such as courtship. That, dear listeners, was where the trouble truly began. For what could be more scandalous than a royal prince seeking affection below his rank? What could be more delicious than a village maid who did not bow, did not flutter, and did not care for titles? But naturally, the Tun would not let such an anomaly pass unpunished. The news reached London in record time, carried on the lips of a footman's second cousin who happened to be passing through Sussex. By the end of the week, Lady Belling was weeping into her vinaigrette bottle and declaring her daughter Clarissa had been betrayed. They had never spoken. Lady Farncombe muttered darkly about seduction and herbs. And the Duchess of Montmere, who had been planning a royal engagement, sent an urgent letter to her niece warning of rustic enchantresses with dangerous ankles. Back in Aylescombe, Daphne remained unaware of the social tempest she had stirred. She only knew that the prince returned each day, always with a new excuse, always with a question about her books or her herbs or her opinions on the monarchy. You are unlike any woman I have met, he said one afternoon in the apothecary's garden, where lavender perfumed the air and bees hummed like old gossips. That is because you have only met women who wish to marry you, she replied, not unkindly. He smiled truly this time, without calculation. And you do not. She laughed, shook her head, and handed him a sprig of rosemary. Not unless you can quote Marlowe. He did, 2 days later, and entirely from memory. And when he returned the book she loaned him dog-eared, annotated, and smelling faintly of lavender, she looked at him with something softer than amusement. Your Highness, she said, you are trying very hard to be someone you are not. To which Prince Valentin replied, No, Miss Sparrow, I am trying, at last, to be someone I might become. Now, dearest listeners, if you think society might take this romance lying down, you have clearly never attended a proper London ball. The claws were only just beginning to show, and scandal delicious, glittering scandal was about to unfold. When, on a fine Tuesday morning, the Prince of Elberdon was seen kneeling not in prayer, nor in proposal, but in pursuit of a runaway duck, it became clear to the villagers of Aylescombe that he was no longer merely a guest. He was a fixture, a bewildering, foreign, lavender-scented fixture. Dearest listeners, it is one thing to tolerate eccentric nobility when they pass through one's village with the dignity of clouded glass visible, but not quite real. It is quite another when said nobility begins assisting with poultry and debating the medicinal properties of yarrow on the green. It's not that I object to his presence, Mrs. Winthrop said, while shelling peas with the solemnity of a clergyman, but I do wonder what a prince finds so fascinating about our Daphne's mortar and pestle. Perhaps he's after a cure for loneliness, Mr. Tomlinson replied, and though the man's front teeth had long since emigrated, his insight remained remarkably intact. Meanwhile, at the apothecary's cottage, Daphne was not pondering loneliness at all. She was attempting to explain the precise difference between a decoction and an infusion without rolling her eyes. No, Your Highness, you mustn't boil the valerian root so briskly. It bruises the oil. I see, Valentin said, squinting at the bubbling pan as though it had personally insulted his ancestry. And this? Tea. It calms nerves. If taken properly, she replied, adjusting the flame. Drank too much, and it'll have you dreaming of swans in bonnets. Curious. And what does one drink to forget an international treaty meeting with a man who smells of turnips? A stiff draught of whiskey, she said, handing him a spoon. Or a long walk in the rain. He paused, then asked, And what do you take when you wish to forget a prince? Her hand stilled over the apothecary's ledger. I've never had need, she said lightly. But I imagine a day spent scrubbing flagstones would do the trick. Oh, the nuance of a woman's deflection. This author has seen duchesses less skilled in the art of evasion. That very afternoon, as the prince attempted to identify chamomile without assistance, and very nearly plucked tansy instead, a mistake that might have led to visions of dancing bishops, a letter arrived from London. Not just any letter, but one sealed with the sigil of Lady Vexley, whose influence over court introductions was rivaled only by her capacity for theatrical fainting. The letter, which Valentine read beneath the hawthorn tree while Daphne thinned parsnips nearby, was a masterclass in veiled threats. "You are invited compelled to attend the Vexley soiree next week," he read aloud. "Your continued absence from town has provoked speculation." Daphne did not look up from her basket. "They worry you've been abducted by a rogue badger?" "Worse," he said, folding the letter with excessive care. "They suspect I may be indulging in a rural fantasy." She snorted. "Tell them your fantasy involves blisters and nettle stings. They will not be amused. Then they ought to get stung more often." Valentine watched her for a moment, the sun catching in her hair where it had escaped her kerchief. She had the sort of face that did not immediately declare itself beautiful, but rather grew steadily more compelling with every word, glance, and unexpected truth. "Come with me," he said suddenly. She turned. "To London." "To the soiree." She stared at him as though he'd proposed a duel with a goose. "Are you mad? I've nothing to wear but homespun linen and sarcasm. I have tailors. You also have courtiers who would rather eat their own gloves than see me enter their drawing rooms." He stepped closer. "All the more reason to do so." "Is this a test?" she asked, voice lowering. "Because I do not perform well when expected to curtsy to people who believe my worth is measured by the number of ribbons in my hair." "I would never ask you to curtsy," he said. They were silent a moment, save for the wind stirring the apple blossoms. "I cannot enter your world," she said quietly, "and you cannot remain in mine." He opened his mouth, but the words he did not yet know how to shape refused to form. "So instead," he said, "then perhaps we must make a new world entirely." Now, my dearest readers, if you are thinking this sounds suspiciously like affection, I must assure you, it was worse. It was hope. That night, Daphne sat by her window, half listening to the nightingale and wholly ignoring her supper. She did not fancy princes. She fancied books, and honesty, and the scent of lemon balm after rain. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she saw him less the prince, more the man who had asked her to stand beside him, not behind. In London, meanwhile, the Vexley household was abuzz with preparations. Their drawing room had been redecorated in the French style, by which we mean everything was more expensive and less comfortable. And Lady Vexley herself had commissioned a new gown stitched entirely with silk imported from Genoa and embroidered with tiny, disapproving lilies. "She will not come," the lady declared, rehearsing her reaction to the inevitable scandal. "And if she does, she will be laughed from the room." But this author knows better than to bet against a sparrow. Back in Aylescombe, Daphne stared at the parcel on her bed. Inside, a gown the color of pewter smoke, simple in cut, scandalous in implication. And the note, and signed but unmistakable, read, "I would not ask, if I did not believe you belonged." Oh, dear readers, the battle lines were drawn. The invitations had been sent. And the ton, that ever-devouring beast of fashion and rumor, was about to meet a girl who had never once asked for their approval and was all the more dangerous for it. There are few forces on this earth more formidable than a woman with nothing to prove and everything to defy. And so it was that when Daphne Sparrow stepped into Lady Vexley's gilded drawing-room arrayed not in silks or sapphires, but in confidence, calm, and a gown stitched by a Sussex seamstress with hands as clever as any Mayfair modiste, the entire assembly forgot, briefly, how to breathe. Ah, dearest listeners, what a tableau it made. Chandeliers caught the pewter sheen of her skirts like moonlight on steel. Conversation stumbled. Fans fluttered like startled doves. And at the far end of the room, Valentin, Prince of Elberdon, turned at the shift in atmosphere and saw her. He did not blink. "Your Highness," said Lady Vexley beside him, her smile brittle as spun sugar, "I was under the impression you'd brought an advisor." "Not a—" Her voice faltered as Daphne approached. "Local acquaintance." Daphne curtsied, not deeply, but with the precision of a woman who knew what she was about. "You were misinformed," she said, eyes on the Duchess of Wexley's gloves, which had been stitched with tiny crowns. "I give no advice. I only speak as I see." A hush spread, delicious and immediate. If Lady Vexley had been a tea biscuit, she would have crumbled. Valentin offered Daphne his arm, which she took without hesitation. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed an act of gallantry. But this author, ever attuned to the vibrations of the ton, noted the subtle clench of his jaw. The prince was nervous. Not of her, mind you, but of what she might say next. Everyone is watching, he murmured as they moved toward the conservatory. They always do, she replied, but rarely with understanding. You are not afraid. I am not impressed. He exhaled through his nose, somewhere between laughter and disbelief. In the conservatory, where ferns loomed like feathered sentinels and a string quartet played something appropriately forgettable, Daphne surveyed the garden beyond the glass. This is what they call society, she said. A room of people pretending not to judge while judging everyone who pretends. Do you despise it? I find it tedious, she said, turning back to him. But you look as though you've worn its weight too long. Valentin studied her, not with the gaze of a man assessing advantage, but with the quiet attention of someone used to being seen rather than displayed. I have, he admitted, and I fear I no longer know how to remove it. Then perhaps it's time you learned, she said. Now, to say that Lady Vexley's crowd was scandalized would be putting it rather delicately. The Countess of Hanningford whispered so violently into her lorgnette that one feared she might inhale it. Lord Caversham, who had not moved since the Restoration, blinked twice in disbelief. And Clarissa Belling, poor Clarissa, spilled ratafia on her bodice in what may or may not have been a deliberate swoon. Meanwhile, Daphne took a glass of wine from a tray without waiting to be offered one. I believe your country would call that improper, she noted. Valentin took one too. My country would call it ungoverned. She raised her glass. Then let us toast to ungoverned things. And toast they did before the entire peerage, who watched as though expecting the walls to collapse and the chandeliers to tumble. They did not. Alas. Later, as the clock struck an hour too elegant to name, Lady Vexley approached the prince with the delicate tread of a cat nearing a puddle it suspects might bite. Your Highness, she said, glancing at Daphne with a smile so thin it could have sliced ham. Your companion is spirited. She is a woman of discernment, Valentin said. Indeed, Lady Vexley replied, though she clearly meant something else entirely. Daphne, standing beside him, offered no rejoinder. She simply looked at the woman as one might regard a pastry well-formed, but lacking nourishment. A lesser man might have faltered, might have apologized, or explained, or sought to smooth the uneasy ripple now passing through the room like a chill. But Valentin did none of these things. Instead, he took Daphne's hand with deliberation and said, in a voice clear enough to silence the quartet mid-waltz, she is no mere companion. She is the only person here who sees me without needing to be told who I am. And just like that, dear readers, the ton fractured. The Dowager Countess of Ainsleigh dropped her fan. Lord Worthing spilled sherry on his own foot and did not notice. A baronet's daughter turned to her mother and whispered something so improper that the girl was promptly ushered from the room. As for Daphne, she did not blush. She did not fluster. She merely turned to him and said, that was unwise. Truth often is, he replied. They left before the supper course, which was just as well, as the pheasant was dry and the scandal far juicier. Outside, the air was sharp and alive. The carriage waited at the bottom of the Vexley Drive, but neither moved toward it. You've made things difficult for yourself, she said. I suspect I've made them impossible. There's a difference. He looked at her, the night wind tugging at his coat, his expression stripped of all ceremony. I don't want a life arranged like a banquet where every seat is assigned, every course predictable. I want something unscripted, something real. She tilted her head. And you think I am real? I know you are. For a long moment, there was only the sound of gravel beneath distant hooves and the faint rustle of ivy against stone. I was prepared to be your friend, she said finally. Your distraction, even your rebellion. But I am not prepared to be your regret. You would never be that, he said. You would be my beginning. Ah, my dears, your chronicler has witnessed many declarations, some whispered in garden alcoves, others scribbled in sonnets and sealed with wax. But never has one landed with such soft finality. They shared no kiss, not yet. That would come later, and trust me, it would be worth the wait. For now, they stood in the moonlight, a prince stripped of pretense, and a village girl unburdened by awe. And somewhere in the trees, a nightjar sang the first notes of something that sounded suspiciously like fate. There are moments, my dearest listeners, when the entire course of a life pivots not on a grand proclamation nor a thunderous kiss, though we would not object to either, but rather on a single, unadorned morning. And so it was that 2 days after the Vexley soiree and the subsequent social implosion, the Prince of Elberdon stood in a modest Sussex kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair damp from a walk that had begun in determined silence, and ended in a conversation with a shepherd who recited Milton with surprising flair. Daphne was steeping dried lemon verbena in a pot with the sort of focus one might expect from a field surgeon. She did not glance at the prince when he entered, though she did push the second cup toward him with a flick of her fingers that betrayed a certain familiarity. "You're late," she said. "The hens have already forgotten you." "I was detained by a philosophical sheepdog," he replied. "He's of the opinion that monarchy is a construct." She poured the tea with a gravity usually reserved for sermons. "And are you?" "I'm beginning to suspect it." She raised her brows, but said nothing. The silence, as ever, was not empty between them, it was charged. Not with tension, not anymore, but with the strange, tentative intimacy of two people who had begun to see past the scaffolding of ceremony and into the uncertain architecture beneath. Valentin took the cup, sipped, and grimaced. "This tastes like regret and boiled socks." "Then you boiled it too long," she said, unbothered. "Or perhaps your tongue is still wrapped in civility. You enjoy insulting royalty." "No," she said, finally looking at him. "I enjoy waking them up." That, dear reader, was not flirtation. It was challenge, plain and sharp as vinegar. And this author, who has attended more drawing rooms than she cares to count, must confess, it was the most honest thing said to a prince since time immemorial. Valentin set the cup down, untouched. "My uncle has written. Is he the one with the gout or the mistress?" Daphne asked, folding a muslin cloth over Herb's. "Both. He summoned me home." She folded the cloth again, slower this time. "And will you go?" "I must." "Of course you must." Her tone was even, but her hands had gone still. "They'll be planning your future again." He crossed to the table, placed both palms on the worn wood. "It isn't only that. There are matters I cannot leave untended. Trade, inheritance, the council." "You don't need to list the reasons," she said. "I know how the world works." "I'm not sure I do," he said quietly. "Not anymore." She finally met his eyes, and there was no defiance in her gaze now, only something steadier. "That's not a flaw. That's the beginning of sense." He leaned forward, the air between them warm with the scent of time and something else less botanical. "I want to bring you with me." Daphne did not laugh. She did not blink, but her lips parted, and for a single breath she looked almost startled. "To Elberdon? To my life?" There it was. Not a proposal, precisely, but not far removed. She turned from him, picked up a knife, and began slicing feverfew with surgical precision. "You cannot bring a bramble bush into a ballroom and expect it to behave." "I don't want it to behave," he said. "I wanted to teach the ballroom about roots." She paused, knife half raised. "You're certain?" "No," he said, "but I am tired of being certain about the wrong things." Her hand dropped to her side, and for the first time, her voice softened. "You still don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking you not to vanish behind the horizon like a chapter 1 failed to finish." She turned to face him again, and this time, something in her expression gave way just a crack, no more, but enough for sunlight to slip through. "You'd be bored of me in a week. I'm still trying to recover from the last 10 days. She exhaled, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Do you ever stop performing?" "Only with you." The silence that followed was so thick with possibility, one might have bottled it and sold it as a tonic for courage. Then the front door creaked open, and Daphne's father entered, carrying a basket of dried linden and looking faintly surprised to find a prince in his kitchen again. Valentin straightened, but did not retreat. "Mr. Sparrow," he said, with the careful respect of a man who had once tripped over his daughter's duck. "I was hoping to speak with you." The older man set down his basket, brushed his hands on his trousers, and regarded him with the steady calm of one who'd measured out laudanum for 3 decades and had little patience for pomp. "About your daughter, and if she'll have me her future." Daphne made a sound halfway between astonishment and indignation, but her father merely nodded once and said, "The kettle's hot. Speak plain." And so he did. He spoke of duty redefined, of a life that might be rewritten, not erased. He spoke of a palace that had never known laughter until recently, and a heart that had never known challenge until it met a woman who knew her own worth and did not require his title to confirm it. And when he finished, the old apothecary looked not at him, but at his daughter. "It's your choice, Daph. Not mine. Not his. Yours." She did not answer at once. She walked to the window, stared out at the garden where the rosemary had begun to bloom in spite of the cold. "If I come," she said, "I won't wear gloves at breakfast." "Understood. I'll speak plainly in council meetings, as you must. And I won't smile for portraits unless I feel like it. I would never ask you to." This, dear readers, is the moment most tales would end with a kiss. But real love, the kind that steps into the unknown with eyes open and hearts thudding, is quieter. "Yes," she said, and that yes, uttered in a Sussex kitchen with herbs drying on the rafters and steam curling from a chipped teapot, was worth more than 1,000 orchestras and all the diamonds in Belgravia. When they left for Elberdon a fortnight later, the village lined the road, not with pomp, but with baskets of rosemary and small bundles of thyme. To remember her, they said, as though she could ever be forgotten. And now, darling readers, society may whisper, may gawk, may attempt to stitch a new narrative from silks and scandal. But this author knows the truth. A prince came to England in search of diplomacy. He left with something far finer. A woman who taught him that titles buckle under truth, and that trust, once planted, blooms into something wilder and more enduring than courtly love. They were married in the chapel of the palace garden, with no tiaras, no opera singers, and no seating arranged by rank. Only vows, a single sprig of lavender, and a prince who finally understood that love, like a good tincture, must be prepared with care, swallowed whole, and never, ever diluted.